He is the only American president to kill a man in a cold-blooded duel. He is the only commander-in-chief to beat his own assassin nearly to death with a hickory cane. Andrew Jackson was not merely a politician. He was a creature of pure violence. But the war wasn't just on the battlefield. It was inside his own chest. Jackson spent the last 40 years of his life with a lead bullet wedged just inches from his heart. The metal slowly poisoned him. Every single breath was a stab of pain. Every cough was a mouthful of blood. By June 1845, that violence has reduced him to a swollen, leaking wreck, hanging by straps in his bedroom just to breathe. Andrew Jackson was born in 1767 in the Waxhaws, a remote border region disputed between North and South Carolina. It was a lawless area outside the reach of civilization, inhabited primarily by Scots-Irish immigrants who brought with them a culture of clan feuds and violence. There were no functioning police or courts in the Waxhaws. The only law was survival. A man's safety depended entirely on his strength and reputation. If a man showed weakness, he became prey, and any insult had to be met with overwhelming force. Jackson's life began with tragedy. His father died in a logging accident just weeks before Andrew was born. He grew up fatherless on a violent frontier. Physically, he was scrawny, sickly, and suffered from a condition that caused him to drool when he spoke, making him an easy target for bullies. However, Jackson was naturally aggressive. Even as a child, he refused to back down. When mocked, he did not cry. He attacked with the intent to kill. He possessed a terrifying temper and would fight until he was unconscious just to hurt anyone who wounded his pride. Violence was ingrained in him from birth as a necessary tool for survival. Then came the American Revolution. For the rest of the colonies, it was a war for independence. For the Waxhaws, it was a civil war. It was a slaughter. Neighbors killed neighbors. British dragoons, led by the infamous Banastre Tarleton, swept through the region, burning churches and butchering surrendering soldiers. Jackson didn't just watch this, he participated. At 13 years old, he was a courier for the local militia. He saw bodies hacked apart by sabers. He saw the mutilated corpses of his neighbors. His older brother, Hugh, died of heat exhaustion after the Battle of Stono Ferry. His other brother, Robert, and his mother, Elizabeth, would soon follow him to the grave, victims of the war's disease and deprivation. By the age of 14, Andrew Jackson was an orphan. He was utterly alone in a hostile world. He had no family, no money, and no protectors. All he had was a burning, incandescent rage against the British Empire and a survivor's instinct that bordered on the pathological. But the defining moment, the moment that transitioned him from a witness of violence to a victim of body horror, happened in April 1781. The young Jackson and his brother Robert had been captured by British dragoons. They were held in a neighbor's house, starving and terrified. The room was tense, smelling of sweat and fear. A British officer, arrogant and immaculate in his uniform, spotted the scruffy, defiant boy. He sat down, extended his muddy boots, and barked an order. "Clean my boots." It was a simple command. In a normal world, a prisoner complies. But Jackson did not live in a normal world. He lived in the internal logic of the Waxhaws. To clean the boots was to submit. It was to admit he was a slave, a nobody. It violated the code. The 13-year-old boy straightened his spine. He looked the officer in the eye and said, "Sir, I am a prisoner of war and claim to be treated as such." The reaction was instantaneous. The officer didn't argue. He didn't shout. He drew his saber. The sound of steel sliding from leather was the only warning. He brought the blade down with the intent to kill the insolent child. Jackson reacted on pure instinct. He threw his left hand up to protect his face. The heavy steel blade sheared through the flesh of his hand, cutting deep to the bone. It didn't stop there. The momentum carried the blade down onto his head, slicing a deep gash into his scalp. Blood sprayed across the room. The pain must have been blinding, a hot, searing white noise that drowned out everything else. But Jackson did not cry out. He did not beg. He stood there, blood streaming down his face, masking the hatred in his eyes. This was the baptism. The scars on his hand and head never faded. He would run his fingers over the ridges of white tissue for the rest of his life. Whenever he felt them, the rage would return. But more importantly, this event taught him a lesson that would define his pathology. The body is disposable. Flesh is just meat that can be cut, torn, and scarred. What matters, the only thing that matters, is the will to remain standing. He survived the wound, but the infection of violence had entered his bloodstream. He and Robert were marched 40 miles to a prisoner camp in Camden without having their wounds dressed. They were thrown into a small enclosure with 250 other men, with no food, no medicine, and rampant smallpox. Robert died. Jackson, delirious with fever and starving, barely survived. When he walked out of that war, he was a skeleton. He was 14, but his eyes were ancient. He had learned that the world was a butcher shop. He decided then and there that he would never be the one on the cleaning end of the boot again. He would be the one holding the sword or the pistol. This psychological hardening set the stage for the active violence phase of his life. He became a man obsessed with control. He studied law not out of a love for justice, but because the law was another weapon. He moved to Tennessee, a new frontier, darker and bloodier than the Waxhaws. Here, he reinvented himself. He was no longer the drooling orphan. He was the prosecutor. He was the judge. He was the duelist. By his 30s, Jackson's violence had evolved. It was no longer chaotic. It was ritualized. To the modern mind, a duel seems like insanity. Two men standing at 10 paces firing inaccurate pistols at each other over a verbal insult. But for Jackson, the duel was a necessity. It was the only way to silence the noise of his own insecurity. He was a man with no lineage, no pedigree. He had to build an aristocracy of one. Anyone who questioned his honor, his wife, or his courage was attacking the very foundation of his existence. Jackson didn't just participate in duels, he collected them. The records are hazy, but it is estimated he was involved in over 100 altercations, quarrels, and near duels. Most were settled with words or fists, but a terrifying number went to the gun. Every time Jackson stepped onto the field of honor, he was engaging in a game of Russian roulette with biology. He knew the risks. A ball in the gut meant a lingering death from peritonitis, feces leaking into the abdominal cavity, causing sepsis and agony that could last for days. A ball in the limb meant the bone saw, amputation without anesthesia, followed by the high probability of gangrene. Yet he walked onto the field again and again. Why? Because the psychological horror of being seen as lesser was more terrifying to him than the physical horror of being shot. He developed a reputation. Men began to fear him not because he was a great marksman. He was actually an average shot, but because he was fearless. He seemed to lack the biological imperative for self-preservation. When others flinched, Jackson leaned in. This aura of invincibility was his armor, but armor is heavy, and eventually something has to penetrate it. The inevitable happened in 1806. The event that would turn Andrew Jackson from a man of violence into a medical monolith was the dispute with Charles Dickinson. This was not a skirmish. This was a calculated execution that would cost Jackson his physical humanity. Charles Dickinson was everything Jackson hated. He was young, wealthy, arrogant, and, crucially, he was the best shot in Tennessee. The dispute began, as they often did, with horse racing bets and escalated to insults about Rachel Jackson, Andrew's wife. In Jackson's mind, Rachel was a saint, and any word against her was a capital offense, punishable by death. The challenge was issued. The date was set, May 30th, 1806. The location, Harrison's Mills, Kentucky. Jackson prepared for this duel with the cold, detached logic of a mortician. He knew Dickinson was faster. He knew Dickinson would hit him. If they both fired at the command, Dickinson's bullet would likely strike Jackson's heart before Jackson could pull his trigger. So, Jackson and his second, Thomas Overton, devised a strategy that is arguably one of the most psychopathic tactical decisions in the history of dueling. Jackson decided he would take the bullet. He would stand still, allow Dickinson to shoot him, absorb the kinetic energy of a 1-ounce lead ball, and then, if he was still standing, he would take his time to kill Dickinson. It was a plan that required him to treat his own body as a sacrificial object. He was willing to be mutilated to ensure his enemy died. He wore a loose-fitting coat buttoned all the way up, hoping to obscure the outline of his skinny frame, perhaps making Dickinson miss his vital organs by a fraction of an inch. On that foggy morning in Kentucky, the two men took their positions. The distance was 24 feet, 8 yards. At that range, the pistols were essentially small cannons. The air was damp. The seconds checked the flints. The command was prepared. Jackson stood sideways, presenting the slimmest possible target. He clenched his jaw. He locked his knees. He prepared to die or to become something else entirely. The word was given. Fire! Dickinson's pistol cracked instantly. A puff of white smoke bloomed. Jackson did not move. He did not fall. He stood rigid, like a statue carved from granite. Dickinson, horrified, actually took a step back from his mark, gasping, "My God, have I missed him?" He hadn't missed. The ball had struck Jackson directly in the chest. It smashed through 2 ribs, shattering the bone into razor-sharp splinters. It tore through the muscle and buried itself deep in the chest cavity, coming to rest precariously close to the heart. The shockwave of the impact would have felt like being kicked by a horse. But Jackson's will overrode his biology. As blood began to fill his chest, he slowly, deliberately raised his left hand and pressed it tightly over the smoking hole in his coat. He was holding his own blood in. He looked at Dickinson with eyes that were no longer human. They were the eyes of a predator that had accepted its own death and now only wanted company. Jackson raised his pistol. The barrel did not shake. He took aim at the man who had just shot him. He pulled the trigger. Click. The hammer stopped at half-cock. The gun had jammed. By the strict rules of the code, that could have been the end. Dickinson was defenseless, waiting to be murdered. But Jackson wasn't finished. He recocked the pistol. The sound of the hammer clicking back echoed in the silence of the clearing. He aimed again. He shot Charles Dickinson through the groin. The bullet tore through the intestines. Dickinson fell, screaming. He would bleed to death over several hours of excruciating torture. Jackson walked away from the duel. His shoes were filling with blood running down his legs inside his trousers. Only when he was out of sight of his enemy did he allow himself to collapse. The surgeons examined him and shook their heads. The bullet was too deep. It was too close to the major arteries and the heart. To cut it out would kill him. "Let it stay," Jackson said. And so the lead stayed. The bullet that Dickinson fired in 1806 remained in Andrew Jackson's chest until the day he died in 1845. For 39 years, that piece of metal sat there, encased in scar tissue, a toxic kernel at the center of his being. It was the beginning of the Iron Graveyard. From that day forward, Jackson was never painless. Every breath he took for the next 4 decades was a reminder of the violence he had chosen. The lead began its slow, invisible work. The body horror had transitioned from the sudden slash of a sword to the slow, grinding erosion of heavy metal poisoning. The general was born, but the man began to die. The smoke from the pistol at Harrison's Mills cleared, but the smoke inside Andrew Jackson's body was just beginning to gather. The creature that walked off that field in Kentucky was forged by the physiology of the wound he sustained from Charles Dickinson. The ball had entered the chest, fractured 2 ribs, and lodged in the pleural cavity. In 1806, surgery was a brutal game of excavation. Without x-rays, a surgeon had to probe the wound with fingers or unsterilized metal instruments, feeling for the foreign object in a bloody tunnel of torn muscle. In Jackson's case, the probe stopped. The bullet was too deep. It was nestled against the pericardium, the delicate sac surrounding the heart. To cut it out would risk nicking the heart or the great vessels, which meant instant death. The surgeon stitched the skin and left the lead inside. This decision defined Jackson's pathology for the rest of his life. The human body does not welcome foreign lead. It reacts. Jackson's immune system launched a permanent, futile war against the intruder. The bullet became a nidus for chronic infection. It didn't just sit there. It irritated the lung tissue with every single breath he took. For the next 39 years, Jackson suffered from a condition where the airways became damaged and widened, allowing mucus and bacteria to pool. He developed lung abscesses, pockets of pus that would fill up, causing fever and agony, until they finally ruptured. Jackson would then undergo violent coughing fits, hacking up blood, pus, and necrotic tissue until the abscess drained. Then the cycle would reset. He was drowning in his own fluids, not once but periodically, for decades. This was the passive horror setting in. The romantic image of the duelist faded, replaced by the reality of a man who smelled of sickness, whose handkerchiefs were always stained red. But the violence of the world wasn't done with him yet. He needed more metal to complete the collection. 7 years after the Dickinson duel, Jackson found himself in another conflict. This time, it wasn't a formal duel with rules and seconds. It was a street brawl, a chaotic, ugly gunfight in the hallway of the City Hotel in Nashville. The dispute was with the Benton brothers, Jesse and Thomas Hart Benton. It was a senseless feud born of misunderstood honor and ego, Jackson's fatal weakness flaring up again. On September 4th, 1813, Jackson charged Thomas Benton. In the ensuing melee, Jesse Benton fired a pistol loaded with 2 balls and a heavy slug. The slug struck Jackson in the left shoulder. It was a devastating hit. The lead smashed the humerus bone, splintering it into fragments, and lodged firmly against the bone marrow. Jackson collapsed, bleeding profusely. The blood soaked through 2 mattresses in the hotel room, where they laid him. The doctors arrived with their saws. The arm was a ruin. In 1813, a compound fracture from a gunshot wound meant one thing: amputation. They told Jackson the arm had to go to save his life. Lying on the bed, drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss and shock, Jackson opened his eyes. The iron will kicked in. He looked at the surgeon and growled, "I'll keep my arm." He forced them to poultice it with elm and other folk remedies. He lay there for weeks, the smell of rotting flesh hovering over him as his body fought the gangrene. Miraculously, he kept the arm. But the bone healed poorly, and crucial point, the bullet remained. Now, Andrew Jackson was a walking metal graveyard. He had a slug in his chest and a slug in his shoulder. He was carrying ounces of industrial lead in his vital systems. By this stage, Jackson was less a politician and more a deteriorating biological specimen. The lead was insidious. It is not an inert metal when placed inside the human body, especially in contact with synovial fluid or blood-rich tissue. Over decades, lead bullets can degrade, leaching lead ions into the bloodstream. This is a condition known as plumbism or chronic lead poisoning. The historical record of Andrew Jackson's health complaints matches the symptoms of lead poisoning with terrifying precision. First, there was the lead colic, often called painter's colic in that era. Lead destroys the nervous system of the gut. It causes peristalsis, the rhythmic contraction of the intestines, to seize up. The result is abdominal pain of a magnitude that is difficult to describe. It feels like the intestines are being twisted by hot iron pincers. Jackson suffered from this for the rest of his life. He simply called it the cramps. Historians record instances where the general, the toughest man in America, would be found rolling on the floor, clutching his stomach, groaning in animalistic agony. He would lean his chest against a sapling tree or the back of a chair for hours, trying to use physical pressure to counteract the internal cramping. This wasn't a stomach ache. This was his nervous system firing pain signals at maximum volume, triggered by the bullets he refused to remove. Second, there was obstinate constipation. Because his gut was paralyzed by lead, Jackson could not defecate normally. He suffered from chronic, severe blockage. His digestive tract was a stagnant swamp. This caused him to feel constantly bloated, toxic, and nauseous. He was literally full of waste. And third, there was the neurological instability. Lead is a neurotoxin. It affects the brain. It degrades cognitive buffers. It makes a person irritable, paranoid, and prone to explosive outbursts of rage. Jackson was famous for his temper. He would go from calm to volcanic in a split second. His face would turn purple. He would slam his fists so hard tables would crack. Was this just his personality? Or was it the lead eroding the neural pathways that regulate emotion? We cannot say for certain, but the correlation is scientifically sound. The bullets were likely driving the rage that fueled his politics. If the disease was horrific, the cure was worse. To treat his colic, Jackson doubled down on the standard medicine of the time, calomel. Since it was 60% mercury by weight, he was effectively poisoning himself to cure the poison. Doctors of the era believed that disease was caused by an imbalance of bile. To cure the constipation, they needed to purge the system. Calomel was a thunderclapper, a massive, violent laxative. It worked by irritating the lining of the stomach and intestines so severely that the body would violently expel everything in it to get rid of the poison. Jackson didn't just take calomel occasionally, he took it religiously. He took massive doses, often combined with blue mass pills, another mercury compound. He was ingesting enough mercury to kill a modern human. This created a secondary layer of toxicity. Now we have a man with lead poisoning being treated with mercury poisoning. The symptoms of mercurialism began to manifest, creating a grotesque symphony of decay alongside the lead symptoms. Mercury stimulates the salivary glands, and Jackson often complained of excessive drooling or having a bad taste in his mouth. Mercury causes the gums to become inflamed and spongy. The teeth loosen and fall out. By his presidency, Jackson's mouth was a wreck of decaying teeth and bleeding gums. He suffered from constant toothaches, which he treated by taking more calomel. Then there were the mercury tremors, known as the Hatter's shakes. Mercury attacks the cerebellum, which controls fine motor skills. Jackson's handwriting, once bold and flowing, became shaky and jagged in his later years. His hands trembled so much he sometimes had to use both hands to hold a cup. And finally, erethism, or the Mad Hatter syndrome. Like lead, mercury causes psychological disintegration. It causes pathological shyness, anxiety, and, crucially, extreme irritability. By the time Jackson rose to national prominence as the hero of the Battle of New Orleans And later, as a presidential candidate, he was caught in a biological death spiral. The cycle went like this. The lead bullets caused intestinal paralysis and pain. To stop the pain, he took calomel. The mercury caused gum rot, diarrhea, and stomach lining destruction. The pain from the stomach destruction made him feel weaker and more constipated, so he took more calomel. He was trapping himself in a feedback loop of chemical self-destruction, and yet he functioned. This is the uncanny aspect of his story. A normal man would have been bedridden. Jackson was not only walking, he was leading armies. During the Creek War, shortly after the Benton shooting, the general is 46 years old. He has a shattered arm in a sling that is oozing pus and bone fragments. He has a bullet in his chest making him cough blood. He is suffering from dysentery, bloody diarrhea likely exacerbated by the mercury. He is starving. His stomach is so ravaged he cannot keep down hard food. While his soldiers eat beef, the general survives on acorns and gin. He is skeletal. His uniform hangs off him like a shroud. His face is gaunt, yellowed by jaundice from liver damage. And yet, this living corpse is the most terrifying thing in the forest. He threatens to shoot any soldier who deserts. He walks the lines, propped up by sheer hate, eyes burning with fever. The soldiers call him Old Hickory because he is as hard and unbending as the wood. But they don't realize that the hardness is a rigor mortis of the living. He has to be hard, because if he relaxes for 1 second, the pain will consume him. There's a moment during the mutiny of 1813 that perfectly encapsulates this body horror. His troops, starving and tired, decide to march home. Jackson rides his horse in front of them. He rests his good arm on his saddle. He pulls a musket with his shattered arm, the one with the bullet still grinding against the bone, and rests the barrel across the neck of his horse. He tells them he will kill the first man who steps forward. His face is a skull, his arm is rotting, he is trembling with fever, but the violence radiating from him is so palpable that an entire army backs down. They are not afraid of his gun. They are afraid of the monster that pain has created. They look at him and see a man who has already died but refuses to leave. As he moved from the battlefield to the political arena, Jackson didn't leave the pain behind. He brought it to Washington. The era of the common man was led by a man who could rarely eat a meal without agony. Every veto, every rage-filled letter, every ruthless decision of his presidency reflects this toxicology report. He was a man with no physical peace. How can a man negotiate peace for a nation when he is at war with his own gut? He was building a political empire while his body was actively trying to dissolve itself. The lead was heavy in his chest. The mercury was rising in his brain. The stage was set for the White House, not as a seat of glory, but as a torture chamber. If the lead bullets were the physical poison in Andrew Jackson's system, the election of 1824 was the psychological toxin. Jackson had won the popular vote, yet the presidency was handed to John Quincy Adams through what Jackson termed a corrupt bargain. For 4 years, Jackson sat in Tennessee, his body rotting from the mercury and lead, his mind stewing in a broth of resentment. He viewed the Adams administration not just as political rivals, but as usurpers who had stolen the will of the people. This period of dormancy was dangerous. It allowed his rage to calcify. He spent these years coughing up blood at the Hermitage, planning a revenge that would be total and absolute. When the campaign of 1828 began, it was not a debate on tariffs or infrastructure. It was a descent into the gutter, widely considered the dirtiest election in American history. And the target was not Jackson's policies. It was his open wound, his wife, Rachel. Rachel Jackson was the only soft thing in Andrew Jackson's life. She was his anchor to humanity, the only person who could soothe the savage tremors of his mercury-poisoned nervous system. But she was also a woman with a complicated past. She had been married before to a cruel man named Louis Robards. She had married Jackson believing her divorce was finalized, but it was not. Technically, for a brief period, she had been a bigamist. The Adams campaign seized on this legal technicality with the viciousness of a pack of wolves. They printed pamphlets calling Rachel a convicted adulteress. They painted Jackson as a seducer who stole another man's wife. In the 19th century, this was not just slander, it was social annihilation. Jackson shielded Rachel as best he could, but he could not stop the ink from flowing. Every attack on Rachel triggered a physical reaction in Jackson. Witnesses described him reading the newspapers, his face draining of color, his frail, lead-poisoned body shaking so violently that his cane would rattle against the floorboards. His colic flared up constantly. The stress exacerbated his digestive paralysis. He was in constant blinding pain fueled by a helplessness he had not felt since he was a prisoner of war in the Waxhaws. He couldn't challenge a newspaper to a duel. He couldn't shoot a rumor. He had to swallow the poison. Jackson won the election in a landslide. The people wanted the general, but the victory came with a price that Jackson was unwilling to pay. In December 1828, as they prepared to leave for Washington, Rachel Jackson collapsed. The stress of the campaign, the public humiliation, and her own existing heart condition had been too much. She told a friend, "I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than live in that palace in Washington." Her decline was rapid and agonizing. Jackson never left her side. For days, the President-elect of the United States sat by her bed, holding her hand, his own body failing him. He was coughing, clutching his chest where the Dickinson bullet lay, watching the only light in his life flicker out. On December 22nd, Rachel died. The scene of her death is critical to understanding the presidency that followed. Jackson refused to believe she was gone. He held her body for hours, ordering servants to lay blankets on her, because he insisted she was only cold, not dead. He had to be physically pulled away from the corpse. When he finally accepted the truth, something in Andrew Jackson snapped. The grief did not make him softer. It calcified him. He looked at the politicians in Washington, the men who had slandered her, and he did not see opponents. He saw murderers. At her funeral, Jackson stood by the grave, leaning heavily on his cane, looking like a specter. He spoke words that should have terrified the nation. "I can and do forgive all my enemies, but those vile wretches who have slandered her must look to God for mercy." The implication was clear. They would find no mercy from him. The journey from Nashville to Washington in early 1829 was not a victory parade. It was a funeral procession. Jackson traveled by steamboat, a dark figure dressed entirely in black, wearing a weeper, a black mourning band, around his hat. He wore this band every day for the next 8 years. Physically, he was a wreck. The stress of Rachel's death had triggered a massive flare-up of his symptoms. His feet were so swollen from dropsy that he could barely put on boots. His headaches were blinding. He was coughing up blood with alarming frequency. He arrived in the capital not as a conquering hero, but as a grim avenger. He refused to pay the customary courtesy call to the outgoing President Adams. He viewed Adams as the architect of Rachel's death. The Washington establishment looked at this incoming president with horror. He was the first president from the West. He was uneducated, violent, and visibly sick. They whispered that he would likely die in office within months. They underestimated the preservative power of pure hatred. The inauguration of Andrew Jackson remains one of the most visceral visual metaphors in American political history. It was the physical manifestation of the body horror of the body politic. Jackson stood on the east portico of the Capitol. He was 61 but looked 80. His face was a mask of grief, his skin yellow and parchment thin. He bowed to the roaring crowd, a crowd that terrified the elites. Thousands of frontiersmen, laborers, and farmers had traveled hundreds of miles to see old Hickory. They were unwashed, loud, and drunk on whiskey and victory. When Jackson finished his speech, which was inaudible to most due to his weak, breathless voice, the crowd surged. They didn't just cheer, they followed him. They broke through the barricades and swarmed the White House. What followed was the inaugural brawl. It was a scene of grotesque excess. Thousands of people packed into the White House. They stood on the satin chairs in muddy boots. They smashed thousands of dollars worth of china and crystal. They tore down curtains for souvenirs. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and spilled alcohol. Jackson was trapped. The crush of humanity was so great that the frail president was pressed against a wall, gasping for air. He was nearly crushed to death by his own supporters. His bodyguards had to form a phalanx and essentially smuggle him out of a back window to save his life. He spent his first night as president not in the master bedroom, but at a hotel, exhausted, in pain, and utterly disgusted. Back at the White House, the staff had to drag tubs of whiskey punch onto the lawn to lure the mob outside, like luring livestock with feed. The residence was left smelling of sour mash and mud. It was a fitting start. The era of polite patrician politics was dead. The era of mud and blood had begun. A rational president would have focused on forming a cabinet and setting a policy agenda. Jackson focused on a scandal about a woman's chastity. This episode, known as the Petticoat Affair, is often treated as a farce by historians, but through the lens of Jackson's psychological and physical state, it is a tragedy. The controversy centered on Margaret Eaton, the wife of his Secretary of War, John Eaton. Washington society, led by the wives of other cabinet members, shunned Margaret because of rumors about her past sexual promiscuity. They refused to invite her to parties. They turned their backs on her. To anyone else, this was high school drama. To Andrew Jackson, it was a reenactment of Rachel's murder. When he looked at Margaret Eaton, he saw Rachel. When he saw the snickering socialites, he saw the men who had killed his wife. The lead in his chest burned. The mercury in his brain fired. He became obsessed. He convened special cabinet meetings not to discuss the economy, but to prove Margaret Eaton's virtue. He produced affidavits. He shouted. He raged. He declared that anyone who did not accept Margaret Eaton was an enemy of the president. This was the toxic rage dictating national policy. His cabinet, men of stature, were baffled. They couldn't understand why the president was willing to burn down his entire administration over a social slight. They didn't understand that they weren't arguing with a politician. They were arguing with a grieving, poisoned man who was projecting his trauma onto the entire government. The conflict became so intense that Jackson stopped meeting with his cabinet entirely. The government of the United States was paralyzed because the president was having a nervous breakdown by proxy. Finally, in a move of unprecedented political violence, Jackson fired them all. He demanded the resignation of his entire cabinet. It was a purge. It was a chaotic amputation of the executive branch, mirroring the way he wished he could amputate the rotting parts of his own body. This amputation style of leadership became his trademark. Jackson is famous for his use of the veto. Previous presidents used the veto only when they believed a bill was unconstitutional. Jackson used it simply because he didn't like the bill or the people who wrote it. The veto was not just a legal tool, it was a psychological reflex. Jackson's life was defined by rejection. His body rejected the bullets, creating abscesses. His stomach rejected food. His immune system rejected the mercury. In turn, Jackson rejected the political establishment. He vetoed the Maysville Road Bill. He vetoed the bank charter. Every veto was a defiant no, a punch thrown by a man who felt cornered. He governed by negation. He didn't build consensus. He destroyed opposition. This was the leadership style of a man in chronic pain. Pain narrows the world. It makes patience impossible. It makes nuance unbearable. A man with lead colic does not have the stamina for long debates. He wants the issue settled. He wants the noise to stop. He wants to crush the problem so he can go back to managing his agony. By the end of his first term, Washington had learned a terrifying lesson. You cannot reason with Andrew Jackson. You cannot intimidate him. He is a man who has already survived his own death. He walks with a bullet in his heart and a graveyard in his gut. He has nothing left to lose, and that makes him the most dangerous man on earth. By 1832, the lead in Andrew Jackson's chest had done more than poison his blood. It had poisoned his perception of reality. He was now engaged in the defining conflict of his presidency, the war against the Second Bank of the United States. To historians, this was a dispute over economics and federal power. To Jackson, it was a biological struggle for survival. The bank, led by the aristocratic Nicholas Biddle, controlled the nation's currency. Jackson viewed Biddle not as a public servant, but as a parasite, a tapeworm attached to the gut of the American Republic, sucking its vitality just as the mercury was sucking the vitality from Jackson's own bones. When the bank's charter came up for renewal, Jackson's health was in a perilous valley. He was bedridden, his frame skeletal, his coughing fits so violent they left him gasping for minutes at a time. It was during one of these low points that his vice president, Martin Van Buren, visited the White House. He found Jackson lying on a chaise lounge looking like a corpse that had been left out in the sun, skin translucent, eyes sunken, breath rattling in his throat. Jackson seized Van Buren's hand with a grip that shocked the younger man. He whispered the words that would define the era. "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." This was not a metaphor. In Jackson's fevered, pain-racked mind, the bank was an active assassin. He treated the institution exactly as he treated the gangrene in his arm or the bullet in his lung. It was a foreign object that had to be excised, regardless of the trauma the surgery might cause. He vetoed the charter renewal with a ferocity that stunned Congress. But a veto was passive. Jackson wanted active destruction. He ordered the removal of federal deposits from the bank, an act of executive warfare that crippled the economy and sent shock waves through the financial system. His advisors warned him that destroying the bank would ruin the country. Jackson didn't care. He was a man accustomed to the logic of amputation. Sometimes you have to cut off the limb to save the body. He was willing to plunge the nation into a recession, to let businesses fail and fortunes collapse, just to kill the monster. This was the leadership of a man who lived in a state of terminal urgency. He governed with the recklessness of someone who didn't expect to wake up the next morning. Simultaneously, another threat emerged that triggered Jackson's obsession with control. South Carolina, his birth state, threatened to secede over federal tariffs. This was the nullification crisis. To Jackson, the Union was a sacred physical body. Secession was not a political right. It was dismemberment. The idea of the Union being torn apart triggered the same violent reflex as the British officer's sword. Had 50 years prior, Jackson responded not with diplomacy, but with the threat of overwhelming biblical violence. He told a congressman from South Carolina to pass a message back home: "If a single drop of blood shall be shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man I can lay my hand on engaged in such treasonable conduct upon the first tree I can reach. He privately threatened to raise an army march to South Carolina and leave the state a graveyard. This was the old Hickory of the Creek War returning. The physical pain he endured daily made him intolerant of dissent. He had no patience for the nuance of states' rights when he was fighting simply to draw breath. He forced the force bill through Congress, authorizing the use of the military against American citizens. South Carolina blinked. The crisis was averted. But the nation had seen the face of its president, and it was a face of unyielding granite, hardened by suffering. If the bank war was a surgery, the Indian removal was a massacre. This is the darkest chapter of the Jacksonian era, and it must be understood through the lens of his fatal weakness, his obsession with security, and his total lack of empathy for physical suffering. Andrew Jackson had spent his early military career fighting the Creek and Seminole nations. He respected their warrior spirit, but he viewed their presence in the American South as an existential threat to the nation's borders. He called them "my children," a paternalistic term that masked a monstrous intent. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act. The tragedy here is one of profound contradiction. Jackson, a man who knew the intimacy of physical agony better than anyone, inflicted a level of physical suffering on thousands of people that is almost impossible to quantify. He ordered the forced relocation of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes from their ancestral lands to the Oklahoma Territory. This was not a migration. It was a death march. It became known as the Trail of Tears. The logistics were handled with the same cold detachment Jackson applied to his own medical treatments. He viewed the tribes as an infection in the white settlements that needed to be relocated. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe of body horror proportions. Of the approximately 60,000 Native Americans forced to march, an estimated 15,000 died. They died of dysentery, the same disease that had plagued Jackson. They died of exposure, freezing to death in the winter mud. They died of starvation. The scene was apocalyptic. Thousands of men, women, and children walking barefoot through snow and slush, leaving a trail of bloody footprints. Disease ravaged the columns. Cholera turned healthy bodies into shriveled husks within hours. The roads were lined with shallow graves. Wolves followed the caravans, digging up the fresh corpses. In Washington, Jackson remained unmoved. He read the reports of the death tolls with a stoicism that borders on sociopathy. How could a man who suffered so much be so blind to the suffering of others? The answer lies in the nature of chronic pain. Constant, overwhelming pain is a narcissist. It turns a person inward. Jackson's world was the size of his own hurting body. He had normalized suffering. To him, life was pain. Survival was a brutal contest. The tribes were losing the contest. And in his Darwinian worldview, that was simply the way of the world. He told Congress that the removal was benevolent, claiming he was saving the tribes from annihilation. It was a delusion born of a fevered mind. He was projecting his own survivalist logic onto an entire race. He believed that to survive, one had to be hard, mobile, and ruthless. He imposed that hardness on the Cherokee, and it broke them. By the end of his first term and into his second, the stress of these conflicts, the bank, the nullification, the removal, had accelerated Jackson's decay. The presidency was eating him alive. Observers noted that he was shrinking. His clothes hung loosely on his frame. He was plagued by terrible headaches that he described as splitting. To treat them, his doctors would cut his scalp to bleed him, a medieval practice that only weakened him further. Imagine the President of the United States sitting in his office, blood trickling down his face from fresh incisions, signing documents that would displace thousands of people. He was also suffering from dropsy in his chest. Fluid buildup around the heart. He would often have to stop in the middle of a sentence, clutching his chest, waiting for the fluid to shift so his heart could beat. He was a dying man running a dying machine, yet the iron will held. He won re-election in 1832. He defeated the bank. He forced the tribes west. He held the Union together. But he was creating a legacy of blood. The violence he had absorbed into his own body was now woven into the fabric of the nation. He had saved the republic, but he had left it scarred, just like him. And as he entered the twilight of his power, the violence would come full circle. It would return to him, not as a policy or a war, but in the form of a man with 2 pistols, waiting in the shadows of the Capitol. On January 30th, 1835, the violence that Andrew Jackson had exported to the frontier returned to Washington. It was a damp, miserable Friday. The air was heavy with mist, hanging over the Capitol building like a shroud. Jackson, now 67 years old, was attending the funeral of a South Carolina congressman. He was not the terrifying general of New Orleans on this day. He was a geriatric invalid. He walked slowly, leaning heavily on a hickory cane, his frame bowed by the weight of the lead in his chest and the fluid in his legs. To any observer, he looked like a man who could be knocked over by a stiff breeze. As Jackson exited the east portico of the Capitol, a man stepped out from behind a pillar. His name was Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter who had descended into madness. Lawrence believed he was the rightful king of England and that Jackson was a usurper standing in the way of his fortune. He was not a political revolutionary. He was a chaotic element, a glitch in the system. He stood just 8 feet from the president, raised a single-shot Derringer pistol, leveled it at Jackson's heart, and pulled the trigger. The percussion cap exploded with a loud report that echoed through the rotunda. The crowd froze. By all laws of physics and ballistics, Andrew Jackson should have been dead before he hit the floor, but the gunpowder did not ignite. The gun had misfired. In that split second, the transformation occurred. A normal man of 67, sickly and frail, would have recoiled. He would have covered his head or fallen back. Andrew Jackson did neither. The moment the sound of the cap registered, the invalid vanished. The chronic pain, the lead colic, the dropsy, it all evaporated under a massive surge of adrenaline. The creature that had survived the Waxhaws and the dueling grounds hijacked the old man's body. Jackson did not call for help. He did not retreat. He charged. Lawrence, stunned that his target was still standing, pulled a second pistol from his coat. He aimed point blank at the rushing president and pulled the trigger. Again, a loud crack. Again, no bullet. It was a statistical impossibility. Later, tests showed the pistols were in perfect working order. Experts concluded that the high humidity of the day had dampened the powder just enough to prevent ignition. It was a 1 in a million chance that saved Jackson's life twice in 10 seconds. But the horror of the scene was not the failure of the assassin. It was the reaction of the victim. Jackson closed the distance with terrifying speed. He raised his cane, the symbol of his infirmity, and transformed it into a bludgeon. With eyes bulging and face purple with rage, the President of the United States began to beat Richard Lawrence into the stone floor. It was a display of feral violence. Jackson was screaming obscenities, thrashing the younger man with such force that the cane threatened to splinter. He was trying to kill Lawrence with his bare hands and a piece of wood. The old Hickory myth had become a terrifying reality. The onlookers, including Congressman Davy Crockett, snapped out of their shock, but they didn't rush forward to save the president. They rushed forward to save the assassin. Crockett and a Navy lieutenant had to physically tackle Andrew Jackson. They had to restrain the leader of the free world to stop him from murdering a mentally ill house painter in broad daylight. They dragged the thrashing, cursing president away, while others subdued the bloody and bewildered Lawrence. This event is the ultimate manifestation of the uncanny strength trope in body horror. It is the moment when the dying thing reveals it is not actually weak, it is simply waiting. Jackson's reaction was not courage, it was a reflex. His nervous system, conditioned by decades of pain in combat, bypassed his conscious mind entirely. The lead in his body had wired him for aggression. The pain had stripped away his flight response, leaving only fight. When they finally got Jackson into a carriage to take him back to the White House, the adrenaline began to fade, and the cost of the outburst became apparent. The monster receded, and the sick old man returned. He sat in the carriage gasping for air, clutching his chest. The exertion had likely torn at the scar tissue around the Dickinson bullet. The coughing fits that followed were severe. He hemorrhaged. The physical price of that 60 seconds of violence was days of agony. But psychologically, the event solidified Jackson's worldview. He became convinced that the assassination attempt was a conspiracy orchestrated by his political enemies, specifically Senator George Poindexter. He refused to believe Lawrence was acting alone. His paranoia, fed by the neurotoxic effects of the lead and mercury, deepened. He saw assassins in every shadow. The White House became a fortress. The president sat inside, nursing his wounds, his suspicions, and his hatred. The Lawrence incident proved that while Jackson's body was failing, his capacity for violence was intact. It was a warning to everyone in Washington. The old lion might be dying, but his claws were still sharp, and he would use them until his last breath. As his second term drew to a close, the active violence would finally cease, not because he wanted peace, but because his body would no longer allow war. He would retreat to Tennessee, to the Hermitage, where the final gruesome chapter of his physical dissolution would begin. The violence would no longer be directed outward at banks or assassins. It would turn entirely inward. The flesh prison was about to close its doors. When Andrew Jackson left the White House in March 1837, the crowds cheered for the departing hero. They threw flowers and waved banners. But inside the carriage, the hero was disintegrating. The ride back to Tennessee was a journey into a private hell. The active phase of his violence was over. He had no more banks to destroy, no more assassins to beat. Now, there was only the passive violence of his own biology turning against him. He returned to the Hermitage not to live, but to endure a slow, grinding execution that would last for 8 agonizing years. The primary agent of this final torture was a condition the doctors called dropsy. Today we know it as severe edema caused by congestive heart failure and renal shutdown. The lead poisoning from the bullets and the mercury poisoning from the medicine had finally destroyed his kidneys and heart. The pump was broken, his body could no longer process fluids. So instead of being expelled, the water stayed. It accumulated in his tissues, turning the once gaunt, wiry warrior into a swollen, distorted caricature of himself. The transformation was grotesque. Jackson's body became a waterlogged sponge. His skin, stretched beyond its limits, began to rupture. He lived in a perpetual state of wetness, leaking fluid continuously. The nights were the worst. He could not lie down without drowning. He spent years sleeping upright or suspended in a harness, a former president dangling like a side of beef in his own bedroom, fighting for air. The isolation was absolute. Pain is a lonely country. Jackson was surrounded by family, by his adopted children and grandchildren, but they could not reach him. They could not drain the fluid. They could not remove the bullet. He was trapped inside the metal graveyard of his body. The coughing fits caused by the Dickinson bullet in his chest became more frequent and more violent. Since his lungs were already compromised by the fluid, These coughing spells were terrifying. He would hack until he turned blue, bringing up blood that mixed with the mercury-induced saliva. He became a living corpse. He smelled of decay, the open wounds on his legs, the rotting teeth in his mouth, the stagnant fluid in his lungs. It created an aura of death that hung over the room. Yet his mind remained sharp. This was the cruelest part of the horror. The mercury had made him irritable, yes, but it hadn't granted him the mercy of senility. He was fully aware of his degradation. He wrote letters describing his condition with a clinical detachment, cataloging his misery as if he were reporting on a military campaign that was going badly. In 1845, the end began to accelerate. The dropsy became total. His entire body was a waterlogged sponge. One visitor remarked that he looked like a bag of water. The pain from the abdominal distension was constant. The lead colic, which had plagued him for 40 years, joined forces with the pressure of the fluid. His digestive system shut down completely. He could barely eat. He existed on small sips of milk and stimulants. This was the price of the iron will. A weaker man would have died in 1813 or 1828. Jackson's sheer refusal to die meant that he had to experience every single stage of physical collapse. He forced his body to keep going long past its expiration date, and now his body was punishing him for the overtime. The violence he had inflicted on the world, the forced marches, the duels, the executions, had all rebounded. He was now on his own forced march, a trail of tears that took place entirely within the confines of his bedroom, leading nowhere but to the grave. On the morning of Sunday, June 8, 1845, the long siege of Andrew Jackson's body entered its final violent phase. It was a warm, bright summer day at the Hermitage. Outside, the plantation was alive with the sounds of life. Inside the ground floor bedroom, the air was thick with the heavy metallic smell of stagnant fluids and failing organs. The Iron General woke up, but his body did not. At 11 o'clock in the morning, Jackson attempted to move. The effort was too much for his ravaged heart. He collapsed from his chair, fainting dead away. The servants and family members rushed to him. For months they had kept him upright to prevent him from drowning in his own edema. But now, seeing the gray pallor of death on his face, they made the decision to lay him down. They lifted the swollen, waterlogged mass of his body and placed him on the bed. He did not suffocate immediately. Instead, the fluid in his chest cavity leveled out, creating a terrifying gurgling sound with every shallow breath. The death rattle had begun. He regained consciousness briefly. This moment is the final dramatic contradiction of his life. The man whose body was a rotting cage of heavy metals and water looked at his weeping family and enslaved servants. The rage that had defined his existence, the mercury-fueled fury, suddenly evaporated. In the face of the ultimate violence of death, he became eerily calm. He looked at the circle of faces, black and white, and whispered, "My dear children, do not grieve for me. I am my God's. I belong to Him." It was a scene of profound cognitive dissonance. Here was the man who had beaten an assassin with a cane, who had slaughtered the Creeks, who had sent the Cherokee on a death march, now preaching peace. But beneath the pious words lay a gruesome physical reality. His voice was weak because his lungs were compressed to a fraction of their capacity. His eyes were dim because his circulation was failing. The calm was not just spiritual, it was physiological. The adrenaline that had sustained his hatred for 40 years had finally run dry. The engine was out of fuel. Throughout the afternoon, the dropsy claimed its final victory. The swelling in his body was now catastrophic. His skin was so distended that his features were barely recognizable. He was no longer the sharp-angled face of the $20 bill. He was a bloated mask of suffering. The servants had to constantly wipe the fluids that continued to weep from his legs, soaking the deathbed sheets. The iron graveyard was flooding. At 5 p.m., the end arrived. The bullet from Charles Dickinson, which had sat in his chest for 39 years, grew cold. The bullet in his shoulder, the souvenir of the Benton brawl, stopped throbbing. His heart, struggling against the pressure of the fluid in the pericardial sac, beat its final erratic rhythm. It fluttered, then stopped. The chest heaved one last time, expelling a breath that smelled of calomel and decay, and then settled. The silence that filled the room was heavy, but for Andrew Jackson it was the first moment of physical peace he had known since he was a teenager. The pain signals that had been screaming along his nerves for decades, the lead colic cramps, the toothaches, the headache, the bone agony, were finally silenced. The flesh prison had been broken. The immediate aftermath of his death presented a final, grim logistical problem. When the undertakers arrived to prepare the body, they faced the horrific reality of his condition. Andrew Jackson in life had been a tall, slender man. In death, he was a swollen giant. His body was so distended with water that they had difficulty fitting him into the lead-lined coffin he had commissioned. They had to handle him with extreme care, fearing that the fragile, paper-thin skin would rupture completely and the former president would literally dissolve before he could be buried. They managed to seal him inside. The lid was closed over the scars, over the bullets, over the mercury-ravaged gums. They buried him in the garden of the Hermitage next to Rachel. The man of blood and iron was returned to the earth. But the story does not end with the burial. The true horror of Andrew Jackson lies in the totality of the wreckage. His political decisions were indistinguishable from his pathology. When the earth finally covered the lead-lined coffin of Andrew Jackson in the summer of 1845, the active violence ceased. The cane was laid to rest. The pistols were holstered. The voice that had commanded armies and dissolved cabinets was silenced. But the story of Andrew Jackson is not a closed book. It is an open wound. The legacy he left behind requires one final autopsy, not on his body, but on the history he shaped with his poisoned hands. The man cannot be separated from the metal. For nearly half a century, Andrew Jackson governed his life and his country while under the influence of a slow, grinding intoxication. The lead bullets from Charles Dickinson and Jesse Benton were not passive observers. They were active participants in American history. They leaked their toxins into the blood of the president, eroding the barriers between frustration and rage, between policy and punishment. The Trail of Tears was not just a cruel political decision. It was the projection of a man who had normalized suffering. A man who lives with a bullet in his lung and mercury in his gut loses the capacity for empathy. Pain turns the world into a zero-sum game of survival. Jackson survived his own body by hardening his heart, and he applied that same brutal logic to the Cherokee Nation. He exported his internal agony onto the landscape of America. The bank war was not just economic reform. It was the paranoia of a nervous system under siege. The heavy metals in his brain told him that he was surrounded by enemies, that the world was trying to kill him. So he struck first. He amputated the financial system with the same desperate ferocity he used to save his own gangrenous arm. He governed by the scalpel and the saw. The tragedy of Andrew Jackson is the tragedy of the iron will. History celebrates his strength, admiring the fact that he stood tall while rotting from the inside, but it rarely asks what that strength cost him, or what it cost the nation. His will was a shield, but it was also a bludgeon. It allowed him to survive the impossible, but it prevented him from finding peace. It turned his presidency into a series of battles leaving the republic scarred, divided, and bleeding. Today, if you go to the Hermitage in Tennessee, you can stand by his grave. Beneath the stone, the bones of Andrew Jackson have long since turned to dust. The flesh that swelled with dropsy is gone. The heart that struggled against the fluid is gone. But the lead is still there. The bullet from 1806 and the slug from 1813 remain in the soil, impervious to time. They are the only things that truly survived. Today, the face on the $20 bill offers a stoic portrait of a statesman. But beneath the shock of white hair lies the sunken eyes of a man who hasn't slept in weeks. Beneath the clenched jaw is a man fighting back a scream. This is the metal graveyard. Andrew Jackson was a man who conquered the British, conquered the banks, and conquered the political elite. But he never conquered the violence within himself. He absorbed it, he carried it, and in the end, he became it. He was the first American president to show us that power is not just political. It is visceral, it is bloody, and it is horrifyingly physical.